It's not a place that a pastor is supposed to be. He's sitting in jail. And yet, have you ever noticed that some of the most powerful things in the Bible were written from prison? We call them the prison letters. Paul wrote letters from prison, and they were some of the most powerful letters in the Bible, some of the most profound insights about God, about the gospel, about who Jesus is. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested for a public protest because he felt that things needed to change. And in jail, as he's there where a pastor should not be, you would think, a pastor shouldn't be there sitting in jail, he finds out that an article has been circulated in the newspapers that was written by 8 white clergymen who wrote saying how, you know what? This is not prudent. This should not be happening. Laws should not be broken by Christians like the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. This should not be how this goes forward. And he had time to think and to pray there in jail, and he wrote what may be one of the most powerful letters in American history, the letter from Birmingham jail. And in that, he responds specifically to their thing, saying, how could you be breaking laws, you who are a pastor, you who are supposedly wanting to uphold justice? And he said this, one may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? There are some laws that he was pushing to make sure that we implement these laws, and there's other laws that he's saying, well, let's not obey those laws. So how do you differentiate those? And he said this, the answer lies in the fact that there are 2 types of law. There are just laws and there are what type? There are just laws and there are unjust laws. How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? And he goes on briefly to talk about the moral law, the law of God as being evident. And then he says this, any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that uplifts humanity is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And there were many unjust laws. Here's one it's the Texas Penal Code, Article 1659. Notice, it is required by law under penalty of a fine of $5 to $25. Doesn't sound like much today, but back then it was a bigger deal. That white and Negro passengers must occupy the respective spaces or seats indicated by signs in this vehicle. There were laws that were unjust that needed to be challenged. This happened in the 1960s, but it's not new to humanity. In fact, if you go back 2,000 years ago, you find Jesus, and Jesus is seeking to help people to clarify what are just laws and what are unjust laws. Go with me to John chapter 5. And in John chapter 5, you find this amazing story where Jesus is walking through Jerusalem, and he walks by the pool of Bethesda. Now, the pool of Bethesda had lots of people who were sick there, and they thought that if they could just get in the pool when there was some sort of motion and stirring that took place, that they would be healed if they could just get into that pool. And how many of those people could Jesus have healed? All of them, right? He could have healed all of those people. But he comes and he sees one particular case, a person who has been an invalid for 38 years. I can't imagine that. I've been alive for 39 years now. 38 years an invalid. He's lying there helpless. And he's alone because he says, I don't even have somebody who could carry me to the water. Nobody cares about this man apparently, but Jesus cares. Jesus cares about humanity. Jesus cares about you and what you're going through this morning. And as Jesus looked at that man, he said, do you want to walk? He's like, hey, I don't have anybody to carry me to the water. And he said simply this, look, man, pick up your bed and walk. Now, Jesus could have just said to him, walk and walk out of here. And it would have caused Jesus a whole lot less trouble because notice what happens. He goes out and he's so excited and he's carrying his bed. And up until this point in the story, we don't know what's going on except for that suddenly there's some people who aren't so excited about this miracle that Jesus has just done. Suddenly there's some people who are watching to criticize. They're looking to see what they can condemn about what is taking place around them. And these people look at him and they say, hey, why are you carrying that bed? Don't you know that today is the Sabbath? the Pharisees, lived to try to find ways to guard God's law. Now, we have to give them the benefit of the doubt. They're looking at things like, first of all, sadly, after this, we find that this is really one of the starting places where they're out to kill Jesus. And it's due to the Sabbath. For this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. Obviously, the Sabbath must be a big deal to Jesus if he was willing to stand up for the Sabbath in such a way that he was willing to face death for it. After this, they begin to persecute him, and they begin to persecute this man because he's carrying his bed. You see, the Pharisees majored in minor things. The Pharisees were really good at looking at the minor details and majoring in those minor things. Jesus says this in Matthew 23, look, you tithe the mint and the cumin. You shouldn't neglect that, but you neglect the weightier measures of God's law, justice and mercy. You're neglecting what really matters. The Pharisees majored in minor things. Jeremiah chapter 17 is where they might have gotten this idea of not carrying a bed from. It says, take heed to yourselves and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day. Then there's a promise. If they're to live like this, if they keep the Sabbath like this, then shall enter the gates of this city kings and princes sitting on the throne of David, and this city shall remain, how long? Forever. So suddenly we see where they're coming from. They look at this and they say, okay, you cannot carry a burden on the Sabbath, and if we only kept the Sabbath properly, then the Messiah would come and our city would be safe forever and ever. It came out of an apparently good position, but it degraded humanity in the process. It's fascinating how William Barclay goes into the scribal laws and what they would do, talking about burden bearing. So they saw Jeremiah 17. They saw that it says not to carry a burden on the Sabbath. It says, but next a burden had to be defined. So the scribal law lays it down that a burden is food equal in weight to a dried fig. They're like, okay, you could carry weight less than a dried fig, but once it gets past a dried fig, then you've got a problem. They're majoring in minors. Enough wine for mixing in a goblet. So you could carry just a little bit under that, right? Milk enough for one swallow. Honey enough to put upon a wound. Oil enough to anoint a small member. Water enough to moisten an eye salve. Paper enough to write a customs house notice upon. Ink enough to write 2 letters of the alphabet. Reed enough to make a pen. And then they go on to argue about things like, should we be able to pick up a chair? How about, can we pick up our child on the Sabbath? They are majoring in minors. They're missing the whole point of what God had come to do with the Sabbath. When we major in the minors, we miss the major things. And we all have this tendency as human beings to major in the minors and to miss the major things. Because if we can distract ourselves by nitpicking about little things, we can distract ourselves from the big thing that's missing in our lives that we desperately need a Savior for. They condemned a man for carrying his bed on the Sabbath. Well, Jesus in Matthew chapter 11 says this to a society that is used to this. They're used to being told how much they can carry on their Sabbath. They're used to this heavy yoke, this burden being placed upon them about God's law that was added to God's law, really unjust laws. And Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, or those who are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Jesus is inviting them to come to a person, to come to himself. And he says, I will give you rest from all of your strivings to measure up, all of your attempts at a works-based system of religion to think that you can earn God's favor. Take my yoke upon you. Jeremiah chapter 5 tells us that Israel had broken God's yoke. So the yoke, which is the law, it tells us, Jeremiah 5:5, it compares it to the law of God. And you will find rest for your souls. Take my law upon you, Jesus is saying. Take what I am instructing you, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is what? Is that good news this morning? My yoke is, say it with me. Let's try it together. 1, 2, 3. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus wants to give you rest. Rest in Jesus. And Jesus majored in people. Jesus majored in people. Jesus majored in giving people rest. He majored in caring for the needs and wants of people. And Jesus had a major interest in the Sabbath. You know, we might think that maybe Jesus is coming to do away with the Sabbath, but really it's something so much better than that. It reminds me of back when Leah and I were dating. And we were actually engaged to be married, and we're getting ready for the wedding. And of all the things to get ready for the wedding, she asked me to do one particular thing that in hindsight I'm thankful for, but at the time it felt egregious. It felt difficult. It felt like something I did not want. She said, you know what? My mom's a hygienist. She can get these amazing bleaching strips for us, and I want you to bleach your teeth so that when it comes to the wedding, your teeth are not the color. And she was very generous about it. That, like, it could just use a little lightening up. In hindsight, we've looked at the pictures. They could use a lot of brightening. And she said now, when she looks at those wedding pictures, that she's so thankful that I was willing to do that. But, you know, day in and day out, as I was putting those things on, it felt like I was hurting myself. It felt like I was not doing the right thing. It felt like those things should not be in my mouth. And I was not the easiest patient to deal with. Hopefully I'm growing. And it was not a pleasant experience for me. And sometimes, as Jesus comes to set his law in order to help us to see the beauty of it, we saw 2 weeks ago that Jesus magnifies the law. He has to do some scrubbing, some cleaning, some scouring that may seem uncomfortable to us. It may stretch us a little bit. Jesus had a major interest in the Sabbath. We see this because he works 7 miracles on the Sabbath, and he enters into 7 controversies on the Sabbath. You know, you got to pick your hills to die on if you're Jesus, literally. And Jesus chooses to confront the Pharisees time and time again about their misuse of the Sabbath. So 2 times before, the lame man at the pool of Bethesda that he worked miracles, Mark chapter 1 and Luke 4 tell us about that he cast an evil spirit out in the synagogue in Capernaum. And then he goes and he privately heals Peter's mother-in-law in Peter's home. He didn't do it in the synagogue. He didn't do it in such a way to arouse people's interest. He waited until he was at the pool of Bethesda. And he didn't then, he was gentle as possible, and yet he had to awaken their sense that they were doing something wrong. And he could have chosen not to have that man carry his bed, but he chose to have him carry the bed to show them something specific, to show them that they were making unnecessary burdens. Well, right after Jesus gives this invitation in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30, come unto me, you who are weary and heavy laden, we get the idea that we know he's giving us an idea about Sabbath rest because the very next story is this one. Jesus and his disciples are traveling along and they're going through a grain field. And as they go through the grain field, the disciples are hungry. And the Torah allowed for you to take as much as you could from somebody's field, just so long as you didn't take a basket and actually take it with you. And so they begin taking kernels of wheat, and they're eating them as they go along. They're hungry. Jesus has been out ministering, and they're following him, and they're hungry. And who's watching? Those who are always looking to nitpick, those who are majoring in the minors, are like, hey, why are you doing this on the Sabbath? What are you doing? Why are you letting your disciples do this? And Jesus does not back down from these Pharisees. Have you not read where? In the law. Does Jesus care about the law? Does Jesus want to magnify the Torah? Certainly. He's like, haven't you read in your own law? Did you not read in your law that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? On the Sabbath, the priests have to work harder than ever. As a pastor, sometimes they joke that Seventh-day Adventist pastors, their Sabbath is on Sunday. Mine actually may be more on Monday. No, this is Sabbath for me. And yet I work more on this day than I do on other days of the week sometimes. That's what Jesus is saying about the priests. And he's saying, and they are blameless. Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. Jesus is like, I am what it is all about. In this very place, you are nitpicking about grain and you're worried about them filling their stomachs. And I am here and I am greater than the temple. The Sabbath is about a person. The Sabbath is about Jesus. The Sabbath is about Jesus. And Jesus is all about people. So if we make the Sabbath all about Jesus, we will discover that we're going to open up more and more to the people around us. But if we are closed off to people around us, if we're building up walls to people around us, if we're nitpicking at people around us, then we might find that though we might be worshiping on the right day, were the Pharisees worshiping on the right day? Did the Pharisees have the truth about the seventh-day Sabbath? But they were nitpicking. They were majoring in minors. They had the right day, but they missed the whole point. But if you had known what this means, so what's the whole point, Jesus? I desire mercy and not sacrifice. If only you had learned what Hosea wrote. Hosea chapter 6, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. The Sabbath is not there for you to get God's favor. It's not there for you to be able to somehow get God to be good to you. He doesn't desire sacrifice. Instead, he desires mercy. He desires our hearts to open up to others as we come into the rest that he offers us on the seventh day. If you had known that I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. We're living in one of two paradigms in our lives. We talked about this at the beginning of the year. We're either living in the sacrifice mentality or we're living in the mercy mentality. And which one we're living in determines how we treat our spouse, how we treat our neighbors, how we treat the people around us. Will we treat them with mercy, or do we require them to earn our favor because we're trying to earn God's favor? The Sabbath is about mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus is abundantly clear on that the Sabbath expresses God's favor to humanity. It's about his mercy to humanity. It's about him inviting those who are weary to say, hang on, pause. And in our crazy world today, do you need a pause? Do you need to say, you know what? I need some rest. I need to be able to say, I don't have to work 7 days a week. I can come and rest in Jesus' finished work as my creator. The Sabbath expresses God's favor to humanity. The Sabbath, Jesus goes on to say, was made so in Mark's account of this, he summarizes this whole thing that Jesus says by saying that Jesus said this, the Sabbath was made for mankind and not mankind for the Sabbath. And I purposely translated it that way, mankind, because the word is anthropos. It's not just talking about men, but it's talking about humanity. You hear the term anthropology? It's talking about all of mankind. The Sabbath is made for mankind. Now notice this though. Sometimes we get hung up on that part of Seventh-day Adventists, but notice the point here. The Sabbath is not made for humanity, right? The Sabbath was made, I made it backwards, right? The Sabbath was made for humanity and not humanity for Sabbath. Really, this gives us the picture that we can't keep Sabbath, but Sabbath is what keeps us. Sabbath is what holds on to us. Sabbath is a gift and a benefit to us. Therefore, Jesus goes on to say, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. So the question, what day is the Lord's day? I've heard many people, we can argue and we can debate about it, or we can read the words of Jesus. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. The seventh-day Sabbath is the Lord's day. Jesus made it super clear. So when we wonder, what's the Lord's day? The day that he resurrected is an incredibly beautiful day. I'm thankful that Jesus was raised from the tomb. But Jesus says, the day that is my day, the Lord's day, is the seventh day. The Sabbath is about Jesus. It's his day. It's the Lord's day. And he lived to benefit people, so the Sabbath is to benefit people. It's a just law that is for the uplifting of humanity, not for the degrading of humanity. So we see we've got evil spirits cast out, Peter's mother-in-law, we have the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, and then we have so far we have two controversies. The lame man at the pool of Bethesda led to a controversy, and picking grain on the Sabbath led to a controversy. So let's go to the next one that's both a healing and a controversy. The next story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Jesus goes into a synagogue on the Sabbath. And Luke chapter 4 tells us that it was Jesus' custom to go into the synagogue on the Sabbath. He regularly came on the seventh-day Sabbath just like you to the temple, or to the synagogue, and when he was in Jerusalem, to the temple. So he's there, and they're watching him. They're wanting to know what he's going to do because there is a man there who has a withered hand. And in that agrarian society, if you have a withered hand, that's a big deal. You can't plow your field. You can't do many things that you needed to do. And they're watching to see what Jesus is going to do. And so Jesus simply asked them a question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? He wants us to consider what is lawful on the Sabbath. If he just wanted us to think that it didn't matter, he would have said, look, it doesn't matter. It's what day of the week I'm going to heal him. But instead he says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? But they kept silent. Some of the saddest words in Scripture. Somebody could have spoke up and said, no. Do good, Jesus. Heal him. But they kept silent. Jesus goes on to say, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Did you know sheep actually do this? Sheep actually fall into ditches, into pits. In fact, you may be able to pull your sheep out of a pit, but apparently it'll go right back in if you're not careful. You never know what might happen to your sheep. So this was a real issue that they had to deal with, trying to pull their sheep out of a trench, out of a pit, because apparently this happens to sheep. And then Jesus says this, of how much more value then is a man than a sheep. Do you see the emphasis here? He's wanting to lift up the value of the human person. He's wanting to add humanitarian value to the Sabbath. They looked at it as this cold, formal thing that they had to do in order for God to send the Messiah. And Jesus is like, no, you got it all backwards. Value the people around you. Open up to people around you. Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And you know, when Jesus saw that they were silent, it says, but they kept silent in Mark 3, verse 4, he got angry. The one time in Scripture where it tells us that Jesus, and it uses the word anger, it was when they kept silent. Every false religion, Desire of Ages comments about the Sabbath, teaches its adherents to be careless of human needs, sufferings, and rights. You can know that it's a false religion if it's teaching you to be careless about human needs, about suffering around you. You know what? They deserve to be where they're at. Just pass by them. Don't worry about them. That is not the religion of Jesus Christ. That is a false religion. But they kept silent. And when he had looked around at them with anger, there's something that makes Jesus angry, and that is when we keep him from healing people, from saving people, from being there for people. When we put up roadblocks between Jesus and people, Jesus gets angry, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts. And then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He got so angry that he healed the man. Jesus' anger is far different from my anger. The last time I was angry, I did not heal somebody or make their life better, I can tell you that. The wrath of God does not produce the righteousness of man. But God, when he gets angry, at least in this situation, you see Jesus heals the man. He stretches out his hand. And what do the Pharisees do? They go off and they grab the Herodians. They're now uniting with the state, and they begin to plot the death of Jesus on the seventh-day Sabbath. This is the insanity that our inhumanity leads us to. We're trying to guard the truth. We want to win the right day versus wrong day debate. And in the process, we're ready to kill somebody on the very day that we're seeking to protect. Then we go on and we find Jesus again in the synagogue on the Sabbath. He often taught in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And this time he sees a woman who's been bent over with a spirit of infirmity for 18 years, and he's moved with compassion for her. And he tells her to stand up straight, and he places his hand on her, and she stands up straight. 18 years she's been a victim of this disease, and now she's able to stand up straight. And the leader of the synagogue is there to say, look, people, there are 6 days in which you could be healed. Go and be healed on those days, but not the seventh day. And if you wonder if we still have issues with that today, I've seen churches and I've seen ministries get angry about whether or not you can have a hope clinic on the seventh-day Sabbath. That might be a little bit too much work to minister to people's needs on the seventh-day Sabbath. I don't know if we should go and do all of that. Jesus responds by saying, hypocrite, you look good. You're winning the right day versus wrong day debate, but you're actually a hypocrite in the process. You're looking like you're for God, but you're against humanity, and so you're actually against God. Does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it away to water? This is the most repeated thing he says about the Sabbath is, look, you care for your animal. How much more should you care about humanity on the seventh-day Sabbath? So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, who Satan has bound, think of it, he's pleading with them, just please think about what this woman was going through for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath. For Jesus, the Sabbath was about setting people free. Doesn't that make the Sabbath beautiful? To know that it's about healing, that it's about setting people free, that it is about making things better for humanity. So we see the woman bent over by a spirit, and then in Luke chapter 14, that's in Luke chapter 13. In Luke chapter 14, we find a man with dropsy, which is like swelling, edema in his body. And Jesus again asks the question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Is it lawful? He doesn't say, you know what? Forget about the law. No, he says, what is the law intended to do? Jesus magnifies the law and shows that it is always for the benefit and uplifting of humanity. Jesus magnifies the law. The Desire of Ages puts it this way, by sweeping away the senseless restrictions of the Jews, Christ honored the Sabbath, while those who complained of him were dishonoring God's holy day. They had the right day, but they're complaining about the very one who is putting it in its right place, who's bleaching the teeth of the Sabbath. By its connection with error, the truth had been serving the cause of the enemy of God and man. That gives me pause. I can have the truth. I can understand the truth, and I can actually be serving Satan himself. I have to take time to think about that. That just because I can win a debate doesn't mean that I'm actually loving my neighbor as myself. Christ had come to place it where it would glorify God and work the salvation of humanity. Jesus stretches us beyond our right day versus wrong day debates. Now, did Jesus worship on the seventh day? Yes. Did he acknowledge the law of God and magnify the law of God? Yes. Did he have the right day? Yes. But he wants to stretch us far beyond that. He wants to magnify the law in our lives because Jesus made the Sabbath about people. And then in John chapter 9, there's the man born blind who Jesus spits in the clay and spits in the mud and makes clay and anoints his eyes, sends him to the pool of Siloam, and that man is eventually put out of the synagogue, and the Jews say, this man, Jesus, could not possibly be from God because he breaks the Sabbath. They're majoring in minors, and they're missing the major thing, that Jesus has come to give sight to the blind. And the final one that I want to present to you of the 7 controversies, it's maybe not as clear as we might think, but as Jesus went to the cross and as he was there on the cross, what day was it? John chapter 19 tells us it was the preparation day. And as he's there on the cross, on the preparation day, the Pharisees first go and say, quick, go and put an end to these people so we can take them down off the cross, these 3 on the cross, so that they're not on the Sabbath, on the cross on the Sabbath. But Jesus is a step ahead of them. When they go to pierce his side, water and blood comes out because he has already laid down his life for you and for me, for the sins of the world, because he loved you more than his own existence. But then they come and they bury Jesus in a tomb. And then do you know what the Pharisees do? It tells us that the next day, what would the next day be after the preparation day? Sabbath. You know where they go? They go to Pilate. And they say, Pilate, that deceiver said that after 3 days he's going to rise again. Would you send soldiers to guard the tomb on the seventh-day Sabbath? Pilate says, sure, here's a guard. You go and do it. And it says that the Pharisees were the ones who go to the tomb, who make it secure, who set up the guard, all on the seventh-day Sabbath to try to keep Jesus in the tomb. And meanwhile, Jesus is resting on the seventh-day Sabbath because nothing can stop his love. His love is stronger than death, and he didn't need to enter into their controversy because the next day, he would rise from the grave. Jesus says to us today, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. The Sabbath is about a person. The Sabbath is about Jesus. And Jesus is all about people. I want to invite you to listen to this song in reflection here as we wrap up today. As you listen to these words, we may listen to it a few times, maybe we'll sing it even during this series on the Sabbath. Reflect for a moment on the beauty of this gift that we've been given. Father, may we find joy divine in how you lived for people. May we realize that the Sabbath is about a person. It's about Jesus who invites us to come unto him when we're weary and heavy laden. Lord, may no one leave this place carrying their burdens, but may they leave them at the foot of Jesus. And Father, help us to enter in more and more fully to what you cared about, and that is the people around us. Help us to open up more and more to humanity around us. Please forgive us for our inhumanity. Please forgive us for the insanity that it has driven us to. Lord, may we love like Jesus loved, and may you magnify the law by writing it on our hearts. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.